Hi, my name is Tanya, and I'm going to give you a simple lesson on supply and supply curve. The definition of supply is the quantity of amount needed or available. Now, what the supply curve does is it shows the relationship between the quantity supplied and the price. The supply curve is always upward sloping from left to right. Price is measured on the vertical axis and quantity supplied is measured on the horizontal axis. The law of demand states that the price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. When there is a decrease in supply, the supply curve shifts to the left. Now, when there's an increase in supply, the supply curve moves to the right. Now, let's talk about what causes that shift. One factor that shifts the supply curve is inputs. An example of an input would be labor. Something like leasing office space is also an input. The cost to lease office space is considered a fixed input because it does not vary. Another factor that shifts the supply curve is substitutes. Two goods are substitutes if you can use one good in place of the other good. An example of a substitute in healthcare is a brand name drug versus a generic drug. We've talked about inputs and substitutes. Now let's talk about goods that are known as complements. Complements are goods that are in some sense consumed together, like coffee and donuts. So, if the price of coffee rises, the demand for donuts will decrease. Future expectations can also shift the supply curve. If prices are expected to rise or fall in the future, the current supply is affected. Our next supply curve shifter is somewhat tied to inputs, and it is changes in technology. Improvement in technology enable producers to spend less on inputs yet still produce the same amount of output. When a better technology becomes available, it reduces the cost of the production, and supply increases, causing the supply curve to shift to the right. The last implicit factor that shifts the supply curve that we will discuss is changes in the number of producers. The rise or fall in the number of producers will shift the supply curve. It will shift the supply curve either to the left or to the right. There are certain characteristics that define this supply model. One is that this supply model illustrates a competitive market with many buyers and many sellers, none of whom has influence on the market. This relationship is dependent upon certain ceteris paribus, which means holding all things equal. A surprising factor is that price is not a shifter. Now let's focus on a couple of concepts that we haven't discussed. One is market equilibrium. This occurs at the point where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. It is considered the optimal point. Let's look at the healthcare law and see its effect on the supply curve. The PPACA, better known as Obamacare. It is the president's signature law and could be the most important healthcare law since Medicaid and Medicare. The intent of the law is to extend healthcare to almost all persons in the United States. Among many things, the law imposes coverage rules, enforces non-discrimination, limits deductions, guarantees renewal, and forces uniform benefit descriptions. What is the effect of the PPACA on access to health care, and how is that effect illustrated on the supply curve? It has been reported that 7.1 million Americans have signed up for insurance under the healthcare law. This means that some 7.1 million Americans who may not have had access to comprehensive health care are now covered under the PPACA. Again, how would 7.1 million Americans signing up for the health care law cause a shift of the supply curve? Will the supply curve shift, and if so, in what direction? We can safely conclude that there will be a shift to the supply curve, and that will be a right shift. And remember that a shift to the right is an indication of increase. Time to do a quick review. Let's remember that a supply curve shift to the left indicates a decrease, and a right shift indicates an increase. There are 6 factors that will shift the supply curve: inputs, substitutes, complements, future expectations, technology, and the number of producers. And don't forget that the equilibrium point is considered the optimal point. Now, let's have a Q&A session. Define supply curve. It shows the relationship between quantity supplied and price. What type of market does the supply curve represent? A competitive market. Define the equilibrium point. It is where supply and demand intersect. Economists use the supply curve as a graphic representation of the relationship between product price and quantity of supply. We have learned several economic definitions such as supply, supply curve, inputs, substitutes, the PPACA, and so on. I hope you can use this presentation as a teaching tool to help you better understand supply and supply curve.